Slavery presented difficult questions for strong leaders, but presented even more of a challenge for the indecisive President James Buchanan. Buchanan's administration would be plagued by slavery-related controversies, the first of which arose on March 6, 1857. In 1856, an important case brought a legal question before the Supreme Court. The case concerned Dred Scott, a slave from Missouri. Scott's owner had taken him north of the Missouri Compromise line in 1834. For 4 years, they lived in free territory in Illinois and Wisconsin before returning to Missouri. Shortly after returning to Missouri, Scott's owner died. Scott initiated a lawsuit to gain his freedom. He claimed that he had become a free person by living in free territory for several years. On March 6, 1857, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney handed down the decision. The court ruled that slaves did not have the rights of citizens. Furthermore, the court said that Scott had no claim to freedom because he had been living in Missouri, a slave state, when he began his suit. Finally, the court ruled that the Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional. Congress could not forbid slavery in any part of the territories. Doing so would interfere with the slaveholders' rights to own property, a right protected by the Fifth Amendment. Southerners cheered the court's decision, and Northerners were understandably stunned. By striking down the Missouri Compromise, the Supreme Court cleared the way for the extension of slavery. Opponents of slavery now pinned their hopes on the new Republican Party as the last hope of keeping slavery in check. In the fall of 1857, the pro-slavery government in Lecompton, Kansas, drafted a constitution and applied for admission to the Union. Free Soilers, who by this time outnumbered pro-slavery settlers in Kansas by nearly 10 to 1, rejected the proposed constitution because it protected the rights of slaveholders. The legislature called for a referendum in which the people would vote on the pro-slavery constitution, and they voted against it. At this point, President Buchanan endorsed the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. Poor choice. He owed his presidency to Southern support and believed that since Kansas contained only about 200 slaves, the Free Soilers were overreacting. Buchanan's endorsement provoked the wrath of Illinois Democrat Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who did not care, quote, whether slavery is voted down or voted up, end quote. Douglas was more concerned about the question of popular sovereignty. Backed by an anti-slavery coalition of Republicans and Northern Democrats, Douglas persuaded Congress to authorize another referendum on the Constitution. In the summer of 1858, voters rejected the Lecompton Constitution once again. Northerners hailed Douglas as a hero, while Southerners scorned him as a traitor. The two wings of the Democrat Party, North and South, moved further apart. In the summer of 1858, one of Illinois' greatest political contests took place, the race for the U.S. Senate between Democratic incumbent Stephen A. Douglas and Republican challenger Abraham Lincoln. To many outsiders, it appeared to be a very uneven matchup. Douglas was a two-term senator with an outstanding record. His large, dominating political presence was in direct contrast to his short stature, causing him to be known as the Little Giant. Lincoln, however, was relatively unknown on the national stage. He was a self-educated man with a dry wit. He was known locally as a successful lawyer and had served one term in Congress as a Whig in 1846. After passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, Lincoln broke with the Whig Party and became a Republican in 1856. As the Senate race progressed, the Republican Party decided that Lincoln needed to counteract Douglas's well-known name and extensive financial resources. Lincoln challenged Douglas to a series of 7 open-air debates on the topic of slavery in the territories to be held throughout the state of Illinois. Douglas accepted the challenge, and the stage was set for one of the most celebrated series of debates in U.S. history. Lincoln and Douglas had very different speaking styles. Douglas exuded self-confidence and would pace back and forth across the stage, using his fist to pound home his points. Lincoln, on the other hand, would deliver his comments solemnly, using direct and plain language. The positions of Lincoln and Douglas were simple and consistent. Douglas believed in popular sovereignty, and in allowing the residents of the territories to vote for or against slavery. Douglas did not believe that slavery was immoral, but he did believe that it was a backward labor system unsuitable to prairie agriculture. Douglas felt that the people would understand this and vote for Kansas and Nebraska to remain free. Lincoln, like many free soilers, believed that slavery was immoral, a labor system based on greed. The crucial difference between the two was that Douglas believed that popular sovereignty would allow slavery to pass away on its own, while Lincoln doubted that slavery would cease to exist without legislation outlawing it in the territories. In the course of the debates, each candidate tried to distort the views of the other. Lincoln tried to make Douglas look like a defender of slavery and of the Dred Scott decision. Douglas accused Lincoln of being an abolitionist and an advocate of racial equality. Lincoln responded by saying, quote, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races," end quote. He did, however, insist that slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong that should not be allowed to spread. In their second debate, held at Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln asked his opponent a crucial question. Could the settlers of a territory vote to exclude slavery before the territory became a state? Everyone knew that the Dred Scott decision had already answered this question as no, that territories could not exclude slavery. Popular sovereignty, Lincoln implied, was thus an empty phrase. Douglas's response to Lincoln's question later became known as the Freeport Doctrine. Douglas contended, quote, "Slavery cannot exist a day or an hour anywhere unless it is supported by local police regulations," end quote. If the people of a territory were free soilers, he explained, then all they had to do was elect representatives who would not enforce slave property laws. In other words, regardless of theory or the Supreme Court's ruling, people could get around the Dred Scott decision. Douglas won the Senate seat, but his response to Lincoln's question had worsened the split between northern and southern wings of the Democratic Party. As for Lincoln, his attacks on the vast moral evil of slavery drew national attention, and some Republicans began thinking of him as an excellent candidate for the presidency in 1860. If 1858 was a year of talk, then 1859 turned into a year of action. Most Americans would probably have welcomed a reprieve from the issue of slavery. Instead, God's angry man, John Brown, reemerged on the scene and ended all hopes of compromise over slavery between North and South. Brown had been studying slave uprisings that had occurred in ancient Rome and on the French island of Haiti. He believed that the time was ripe for similar uprisings in the United States. Brown secretly obtained financial backing from several prominent Northern abolitionists, and on the night of October 16, 1859, he led a band of 21 men, black and white, into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. Brown's aim was to seize the federal arsenal there, distribute the captured weapons to slaves in the area, and start a general slave uprising. In addition to capturing the arsenal, Brown held 60 of the town's prominent citizens hostage, hoping that their slaves would then join the insurrection. No slaves came forward to join Brown and his men. Instead, local militia troops responded to the attack and killed 8 of Brown's men, forcing the insurrectionists to take refuge in the small engine house next to the arsenal's railway. A detachment of U.S. Marines was assembled and placed under command of Colonel Robert E. Lee to deal with Brown's attack. After racing to Harper's Ferry, the Marines, under Lee's command, stormed the engine house where Brown and his men had barricaded themselves. In the ensuing fight, 2 more of Brown's raiders were killed. Brown was wounded, captured, and turned over to the state of Virginia to be tried for treason. Historians have long debated Brown's actions. There is no doubt that Brown hated slavery with all of his heart. However, why did he fail to tell slaves in the area about his plans beforehand? Why did he not provide his men with enough food to last for even one day? It seems apparent that Brown's fanaticism for his cause hindered his planning and limited the effectiveness of his raid. He hoped for little more than to arouse Northern fury and incite a war for the abolition of slavery. On December 2, 1859, Brown was hanged for high treason in the presence of federal troops and a crowd of curious observers. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Although Lincoln and Douglas both condemned Brown as a murderer, many other Northerners expressed admiration for him and his cause. Bells tolled at the news of the execution, guns fired salutes, and huge crowds gathered to hear fiery speakers denounce the South. Some Northerners began to call Brown a martyr for the sacred cause of freedom. The response was equally extreme in the South, where outraged mobs assaulted whites who were suspected of holding anti-slavery views. Slave uprisings had long been a fear of Southern slaveholders, and they were terrified by the events at Harper's Ferry. They were increasingly convinced that Northerners were plotting slave insurrections everywhere. Even longtime supporters of the Union now began to call for secession. One former Southern Unionist explained, quote, "I am willing to take the chances of disunion sooner than submit any longer to Northern insolence and Northern outrage," end quote. Despite the tide of hostility that now flowed between North and South, the Republican Party eagerly awaited its presidential convention in May of 1860. When the convention began, almost everyone believed that their candidate would be Senator William H. Seward of New York. However, events took a dramatic turn. The convention took place in Chicago and opened to surging crowds of delegates, newsmen, and spectators. Despite preparations for the convention, Republicans flooded the frontier city in such numbers that many ended up sleeping on pool tables when hotels ran out of rooms. The 18,000 square foot meeting center, which had been especially constructed for the event, overflowed within minutes of opening. The first day of the convention was passed in forming committees, but as events came to a close, the candidates retreated to their headquarters and began bargaining for the delegates' votes, some working late into the night. Senator William H. Seward appeared to have everything one needed in order to be a successful presidential candidate: the credential of having led anti-slavery forces in Congress, the financial support of New York political organizations, and a desire to be the center of attention. In fact, Seward himself had little doubt that he would be the Republican nominee for president. Well before voting began, Seward drafted his speech resigning from Congress and accepting the nomination of his party. Seward's well-known name and reputation, however, may have worked against him. Lincoln's being relatively unknown probably won him the nomination. Unlike Seward, Lincoln had not had much chance to offend his fellow Republicans. The delegates to the convention rejected Seward and his talk of an irrepressible conflict between North and South. On the third ballot, they nominated Lincoln, who seemed more moderate in his views. Although Lincoln pledged to halt the further spread of slavery as with a chain of steel, in his words, he also tried to reassure Southerners that a Republican administration would not directly or indirectly interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves. His reassurances, however, fell on deaf ears. In Southern eyes, he was a, quote, black Republican, end quote, whose election would be, quote, the greatest evil that has befallen this country, end quote. So the election of 1860 was now set with 3 candidates vying for the office in addition to Lincoln. So there were 4 candidates total. The Democratic Party split over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats backed Stephen Douglas and his doctrine of popular sovereignty, while Southern Democrats voted and backed Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Former Know-Nothings and Whigs from the South, along with some moderate Northerners, organized the Constitutional Union Party, which ignored the issue of slavery altogether and nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Lincoln emerged as the winner, but like Buchanan in the previous election, he received less than half of the popular vote. In fact, although Lincoln defeated his combined opponents in the Electoral College by 180 to 123, he received no electoral votes from the South, probably because he did not appear on the ballot in many Southern states. Unlike Buchanan, Lincoln had sectional rather than national support and carried every free state. The outlook for the Union was grim. Lincoln's victory convinced most Southerners that they had lost their political voice in the national government. Fearful that Northern Republicans would submit the South to what noted Virginia agriculturalist Edmund Ruffin called, quote, the most complete subjugation and political bondage, end quote, some Southern states decided to act. South Carolina led the way, seceding from the Union on December 20th, 1860. 4 days later, news of South Carolina's secession reached William Tecumseh Sherman, then serving as superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary of Learning and Military Academy. In utter dismay, Sherman, an Ohioan who lived in and loved the South, poured out his fears. Quote, this country will be drenched in blood. The people of the North are not going to let the country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and your appliances of war to contend against them? You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right at your doors. Only in spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared. End quote. Even Sherman underestimated the depth and intensity of the South's commitment. For many Southern planners, the cry of states' rights meant the complete independence of Southern states from the federal government. Southern slaveholders also feared that an end to their way of life was at hand. Many were desperate for one last chance to preserve the slave labor system and saw secession as the only way. Mississippi followed South Carolina's lead and seceded on January 9, 1861. Florida seceded the next day. Within a few weeks, state legislatures in Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had also passed ordinances of secession. On February 4, 1861, delegates from these secessionist states met in Montgomery, Alabama, where they formed the Confederate States of America. The Confederate Constitution closely resembled that of the United States. The most notable difference was that the Confederate Constitution protected and recognized slavery in new territories. The new Constitution also stressed that each state was to be sovereign and independent, a provision that would later hamper efforts to unify the South. On February 9th, delegates to the Confederate Constitutional Convention unanimously elected former Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as president and Alexander Stephens of Georgia as vice president of the new Confederacy. Davis made his position clear, noting that to present a show of strength to the North, the South should offer no doubtful or divided front. At his inauguration, Davis declared, quote, the time for compromise has now passed, end quote. His listeners responded by singing Farewell to the Star-Spangled Banner and Dixie. As the nation awaited Lincoln's inauguration in March, its citizens were confused. What would happen now? 7 slave states had seceded and formed a new nation. 8 slave states at that time still remained within the Union. Would they secede too? President Buchanan was uncertain. He announced that secession was illegal, but that it would also be illegal for him to do anything about it. He tied his own hands. But in truth, there was little he could have done. One problem was that Washington, D.C. was in fact very much a Southern city. There were still secessionists in Congress and in all departments of the federal government, not to mention the president's cabinet. Consequently, mass resignations took place. To some, it seemed that the federal government was melting away. One key question remained. Would the North allow the South to leave the Union without a fight?